Okay, welcome everybody. This is the first of the Unit 4 lectures on the Civil War. I'm going to break that into three sections. The causes of the war, or the events leading up to the war, or the path to war. That's what this lecture is about, and I'll probably break it into at least two lectures. Then there is the Civil War itself, and then Reconstruction afterwards. Background of this opening slide is a photo of the actual flag that flew over Fort Sumter, where the war started in South Carolina, with all the stars of each of the states, both Union and the ones that eventually seceded. So like I said, this lecture will be on the things leading up to the war, and I want you to be able to distinguish between the events leading up to something and what actually caused something, the underlying causes. So, for example, let's say somebody crashes their car into the Stewarts on Cherry Ave, Elm Ave. Somebody might say, well, she crashed the car because she was going too fast or because she swerved at the last minute to hit a deer. But if you knew the whole story, you might notice that, or you might know that, say, the person had unwittingly taken a vitamin pill, thinking it was a vitamin pill, and it was really some sort of medication, and then mixed that with caffeine, and so was not really fully functional when she drove, and then she got some very upsetting emotional news, and so even though those things about the swerving to avoid an animal or going too fast are true, those are more the events at the end leading up to something. The underlying causes would be those deeper things, the mixing medications and the emotional distress. It's important to be able to differentiate the two. We are going to study both. We will study the events leading to the Civil War, and we'll study the causes, but you need to kind of be able to distinguish between the two. All right, enough of that. Got a lot of important questions for this section of the unit. It's a really important part of American history. I'm going to talk a little bit about slavery today and why it became so important in the South. I'm going to give you a reading, and that's going to help you answer the second question of the arguments the South made to defend slavery. Talk about why it wasn't addressed more adequately in the constitutional era. And then look at the North. Why did it die out in the North? What was the North's attitudes towards slavery, and what did they think of blacks in general? And then we'll get to why the truce about slavery between the North and South kept getting threatened or broken, and why the 1850s were so difficult in terms of getting compromise. I will probably do those last things in a second lecture. Slavery in the South. How and when did slavery become so central to the South? It's important to remember, we had a reading a long time ago, back in September, on how slavery has been in the South almost from the beginning, and it was in all 13 colonies. So the first point I would make in answering that question, how and when did it become so central to the South, is it has been important from the beginning. If you will remember, the colonists came to a land that was only sparsely settled, and it was full of resources, and so we needed labor. And the South developed larger plantations because the land was more fertile, and they could grow larger have larger farms. And they tried a variety of means to get enough labor to work it. They started with indentured servitude, and for reasons we already talked about, that did not last beyond the 1600s, although it lasted for a number of decades. It was just too easy for people to go west and get new land. Not that it was easy, but it was easy enough, and they lost their labor after 7 years or period like about that. And so race-based slavery began very early on, and by the end of the 1600s was pretty entrenched in the South and was present in all the colonies. The second answer to this question is that in the early years of independence and the writing of the Constitution, there was a movement to end slavery, and some of the northern states freed their slaves or abolished slavery, and there's kind of an attitude that slavery was going to kind of fade away. Slaves were primarily used to produce crops like tobacco and rice and indigo and sugar, and all of those products were under competitive threat from Caribbean islands where they were produced more cheaply. It's a quote from a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Oliver Ellsworth, who said, "Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country." So at the time of the Constitution, the founders decided that it was better to get the nation established and keep the North and South together, and to just kind of not deal with slavery and to give it legal protection. Two things really changed that. One is the early industrialization in England in the late 1700s, and then in the northeast of America in the early 1800s, which created more demand for the raw material of cotton, because the cotton textile industry was really the first major mass production industry. And the second, of course, was the 1793 invention of the cotton gin. It changed everything. In one day, a slave or other person could clean about a pound of cotton. With the cotton gin, they could clean up to 50 pounds. And so it removed the main bottleneck to using cotton, and led to a huge increase in production. Note that it didn't actually reduce labor, it just shifted it from the cleaning of cotton, from the fiber from the seed, to actually working the fields and growing it. Here's a good chart. You see in 1790, around the time that the Constitution was established, about 4,000 bales of cotton were produced in the South. That is, a tiny speck in terms of what their agricultural production was, and there were about 900,000 slaves. By 1820, that cotton figure has gone up by about 10 times, 20 times. 40,000 bales would be a tenfold increase. This is, in 30 years, it's gone up times 20. That's a huge increase. And slavery is almost doubled. By 1840, production has just boomed even more. And you can see that's the area we were expanding into Alabama and Louisiana and even Texas. And you just see the cotton production goes up by, what is that number? That is times 2, it's like 200 times bigger. It's just a massive increase. And slavery demand goes up and then up again by 1860. So the answer to this question is that slavery becomes central to the South in the 1800s, after the invention of the cotton gin, when cotton production just goes through the roof. And cotton was known as king cotton. By the Civil War, something like 60% of America's exports were cotton. So it's really a fairly simple story. All right. A couple other things about the South. If you look at this slide, just take a moment and note the differences between the Old South of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, and the newer southern states. The short fiber cotton, the important kind of cotton that Eli Whitney made us able to grow, um, was really in these deep south states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. The upper south, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, don't really have that much cotton production, and that is going to show up in the slave numbers as well. So this is a pretty important slide. This one's even more important. Take a moment to look at these and note the states that have interesting population patterns. So the green is how many whites were in the state, the blue is how many slaves, and the orange is the proportion of free blacks. So you look at Missouri, 90% white. Before I say it, why don't you note which states stand out as kind of surprising for the proportion of white slaves and free blacks. So I would pick out Mississippi, South Carolina, probably the two that are the most surprising. Over half the population are slaves. That's just massive. And in general, you see that the deep south states have a very high proportion of slaves, and the upper south, there really aren't that many. One of Lincoln's, I'm going to jump ahead, one of Lincoln's tactics during the Civil War is he is going to try to keep these upper south states from seceding, knowing that they do not have the deep connection to cotton and to slavery that the southern states do. He's going to be mostly unsuccessful with that, although he has some key successes. And then note up here, these are still southern states. We've talked about this a number of times. Maryland and Delaware are southern states, but Maryland is almost all either free whites or free blacks, and Delaware has very few slaves at all, but it still has some. So this is, I think, a really interesting chart and very helpful for understanding the differences between the South. They asked a question here, given the data on this map, where would you predict the strongest sentiments among whites for states' rights and even perhaps secession from the Union? And it's obvious where that's going to be. Okay. Next, this is also a really important slide. This is the class structure in the South. 3/4 of all the white Southerners did not own slaves, and that is a really important fact. 25% did own slaves, so 1 out of every 4. But of those who did, most of them owned just a few slaves, 1 to 9. A small proportion, about 7%, owned up to 100 slaves. And then a tiny, tiny fraction of plantations, 0.1% of people, were very, very large. But the strange thing is those large plantations were massive and actually controlled a lot of land and held most of the wealth and most of the power in the South. So it was a very extreme class pyramid, and those slave owners at the South held a lot of power and determined what went on in terms of Southern politics. But I want to talk about the poor Southern whites, those non-slaveholders, for a little bit. It's a painting called North Carolina Immigrants, Poor White Folks. How did slavery affect Southern whites who owned no slaves? So the answer to that, if you think about it, what are slaves going to do to wages? If you are a rich person in the South and you can afford to hire people, would you rather hire a poor white worker or buy a slave? You're probably more likely to buy a slave. So what that is going to do is it is going to lower wages. Southern whites are going to get paid less for their work because there are slaves around who can be forced to do the job. So the answer to that first question is really important, is that economically, Southern whites were hurt by slavery. They would have been better off not having slavery because slaves provided wage competition to them. Ironically, though, Southern white slave owners adamantly supported slavery. They were super extreme in their hatred of blacks and in their support for not allowing slavery to end. That's best explained as more of a psychological thing, where it made poor Southern whites feel better about themselves that they were able to look down on and be superior to black slaves. So that is probably the reason for that. Let's cut I'm at almost 16 minutes. Let's cut the slideshow here, and we will continue this with a second show. Thanks, guys.